Chapter 29. After I had made a division of the societies of Paris, I considered of the means of extending a watchful superintendence over the several classes of artisans inhabiting the suburbs. This was rather the duty of the prefect of police, but I felt desirous to possess the means of finding out a clue to any public disturbance in the event of my not being satisfied with the reports I should receive from the prefecture. It was nothing more than a measured precaution. I had already discovered that the most powerful instrument of my administration was to bring every element of hatred and rivalry into contact, at the same time that it became its duty to prevent the evil effects of those passions. There certainly is danger in proceeding by such a method, and nothing short of the greatest personal probity can afford any self-protection against the abuse of it, or against being deceived by information originating in animosity or some secret vice. I seldom resorted to this course except with the view of acquiring knowledge of events anterior to my charge, which was indispensable towards making me acquainted with different characters with whom I was in daily intercourse. I was a perfect stranger to the Revolution. I had been in no way connected with the National Assemblies, the clubs, the horrors of the Civil War, and was consequently ignorant of whatever related to men who had acquired some notoriety in those different circumstances, and who nevertheless held, for the most part, some lucrative employments. The men of the Revolution had considered all public places as their property. In the midst of this chaos, I felt like a blind man groping his way. People readily partook in my excellent dinners. The carriages formed a long line from the entrance to my hotel. I kept up an imposing appearance. The company I received every Monday seldom fell short of 400 visitors. Had I, however, been under the necessity of drawing a conclusion or of forming my opinion from what had been said to me on those bustling assembly nights, I should have led others astray and told anything but the truth. My eyes were open to this, and I accordingly turned in another direction for a safe guide. I stood alone, without a party or flatterers to encourage me. Not that I had any concealed views which compelled me to resort to them, but in the land I lived in, and on the ground I occupied, I was sowing with the intention to reap. I required some weapon against the shafts of ridicule, the most powerful enemy which a placeman in France can have to contend with. I determined, therefore, to make myself a party of dependents, and as all my colleagues had 10 years to start on me in their respective places, during which they had greatly strengthened their own parties, it behooved me to reach the goal at the same time by striking out as many new paths as would bring me up with them in the race. I began by claiming in my right of office the nomination to all the places subordinate to the prefecture of police. They were considerable in number, and the more suitable to my views, as they extended to a great distance and furnished ready means of information in the event of any disturbance. I preferred the report of an eyewitness to any occurrence to a report cautiously drawn up in a closet, from which anything calculated to incriminate an individual whom it was wished to patronize had been carefully omitted. I was anxious to know the truth, and relied sufficiently on my own judgment not to fear my being imposed upon, besides which, if favor was to be bestowed upon anyone, it was particularly my desire to be the immediate dispenser of it. This was a set-off against the most unpleasant duties a man could have to perform. I found some difficulty in securing to myself the nomination of places in the prefecture of police, which was only accomplished by an imperial decree. The emperor himself was rather reluctant to alter existing regulations, and I had first to satisfy him that I claimed the right to those nominations wholly for the good of his service. I was then enabled to create means of information for myself, and all the persons employed in the prefecture benefited by the change, because they thenceforward depended for advancement upon the manner in which they performed their duties, and were not as heretofore exposed to the consequences of unfavorable reports. I succeeded gradually in appointing useful commissaries of police in large and small towns. I took care that they should not only be men of good education, but that penetrating and clear mind which follows up in information without ever departing from the rules of civility, and without any injury accruing to society from their proceedings. I took care to reward those whose exertions were productive of advantage, without their having raised any murmur against them, and altered the station of everyone against whose conduct complaints had been made. But I never forsook a man of bold and unflinching character, who wasn't sparing of his person when it was question of acquiring information. When I found an agent placed at a station where his talents were confined within too narrow bounds, I had him removed to a wider field of action. My arrangements were now sufficiently extensive, though they served me rather as resources in case of need than as positive means of information, and I resolved to establish certain regulations respecting the police of servants, a class of people in Paris who form of themselves an army. What decided me to adopt this course was my observing that most robberies were committed by servants, and all persons detained on a criminal charge were of that class. Less inquiries are made in Paris than in any other town in the world when a person offers himself as a servant in a family. Any opportunity afforded by a want of proper care on the part of society will never escape the penetration of bad men. It is to them a fruitful harvest. When a robber escapes from a prison or the galleys, he makes his way to Paris, begins by engaging as a servant in order to have opportunities of knowing his companions and of making his private remarks under his master's own roof and protection. It is difficult to subdivide that numerous class of men so as to establish a rigid system of watchfulness over them. Nevertheless, under M. Pasquier's administration, I succeeded in effecting this object. I had no other object in view than to protect private families when I proposed the measures which would go to forbid anyone from taking a servant unless his little book were countersigned at the prefecture of police. Those little books resembled the books which are distributed amongst the soldiery. On the first leaf were written the name, age, and description, the names of the father and mother, the country and business, the date of arrival in Paris, and a specification of the certificates of good conduct. If householders had not taken some servants unprovided with these little books, all servants would have to be compelled to present themselves at the prefecture for the purpose of obtaining such a book, and this office would have taken advantage of the circumstance to register them all and drawn up lists in alphabetical order which might have afterwards been consulted with the view of ascertaining whether they presented any names or descriptions corresponding in any way with the persons who were the objects of inquiry. According to the measure which I proposed for adoption, a householder was to take possession of the notebook to be exhibited by his servant, and when he sent him away, he was to write in it the day on which he had left the service without adding any reflections whatever. These he might send separately, but not put them down in the book, in order to save the poor servants from the consequence of any act of injustice. He did not hand the book back to the servant, but sent it to the prefecture, where they recorded in the notice which applied to the servant in question the fact of his having quitted the house where he had been in service, and the grounds of his dismissal. If the master had communicated them, the servant was required to present himself at the prefecture within a short lapse of time to take away his book. Otherwise, he would suffer an imprisonment of as many days as he had delayed conforming to the rule, as well as the master of the house where he may have been admitted to lodge without his being called upon to produce his book. This measure, although purely administrative in its nature, unobjectionable in all its clauses, very little complicated and calculated to produce the most useful results, met nevertheless with opposition in the council state. Some persons of a suspicious turn of mind saw in my proposal nothing else than a system of prying directed against themselves, and their clamor against it bordered on frenzy. It would have failed of success had it not been for M. Pasquier, who pointed out its advantages and whose sound views overpowered all opposition. His opinion prevailed. The measure was carried into effect, and in the very first months, it was a means of placing at the disposal of the administration from 900 to 1,000 individuals, as far as I recollect, who were all either deserters from the army or runaways from prison or the galleys, as well as fugitives from the native country in consequence of illegal prosecutions. They became spies upon each other, a course which worked Well, for a short time, I felt anxious to avail myself of this apparently favorable moment to organize all the drivers of the hackney coaches and cabriolets, of which there are about 3,000 in the city of Paris. But notwithstanding the imperative reasons I urged for the adoption of my views, I met from the Council of State the same opposition as before, and was under the necessity of renouncing them. My object was to divide the hackney coaches as well as the cabriolets of Paris into companies of 25 each and to farm them out. One contractor would assign his name for one or more companies. Several would have associated together and likewise signed their names for one or more companies. The conditions would have been that the coaches of one company should have a uniform color, and that the horses of the company should also be one color. The drivers were to carry cloaks of a color corresponding with that of their coaches and to wear glazed hats. The horses were to be brought every month before veterinary surgeons, and a penalty to be imposed for every horse found attacked with farcy, the glanders, or any other disease. A fine was equally to be imposed in case the harness was not in a sound condition. The latter fine to be borne by the driver if the traces or any part of the harness should happen to break during his drive. A still heavier fine would be imposed upon if the contractor, if either the coach or a wheel should break down, and the persons inside should be compelled to get out previously to reaching their destination. The advantage of these rules for the administration was, in the first place, that they would have competent guarantees in the contractors. Secondly, the coaches would be in a more decent condition and would do better service. And lastly, the horses would be far more efficient and so sound as no longer to expose other horses near them to the danger of any contagious disorder. A farther advantage would have been attained in a point of view to which the administration was by no means indifferent. There are hackney coaches in Paris bearing numbers consisting of 4 ciphers. It requires some stretch of memory to recollect them, whereas, by numbering them only according to their company, nothing could be easier than for a person to say, for instance, I had a 20th coach of the first company. If engaged at night, as all the horses of one company would be the same color, the coach itself would have a determinate color. Everyone, on retiring from a party, might easily say, at such and such an hour and in such and such a street, I hired a yellow-painted coach with a gray horse. Thus the company is at once pointed out. I have only to discover which of the 25 coachmen was in the quarter where the coach had been engaged. An inquiry of no difficulty, because those who have nothing to reproach themselves with will always tell the truth, whereas the guilty person will be the last to appear if he has not presented himself at once. Had I succeeded in procuring the adoption of this measure, every stand in Paris would, in less than a 12-month, have been composed of respectable coaches with decent-looking drivers and solid harnesses. And the wretched public vehicles in use would have disappeared. Thus, farther advantage would have been gained that the drivers who are men capable of embarking on any mischief would have been the subject to an examination and placed under the responsibility of the contractors who could not have taken any that were unprovided with the notebook from the prefecture of police. M. Pasquier failed in his endeavors to carry this measure through, although founded upon correct principles and the best administrative views. I was therefore compelled to leave in the condition in which I found them those 50 receptacles for all bad subjects, who thus ended the researches, however active, which were made in pursuit of them. I heard great praises bestowed on the administration of M. Le Noir, who was lieutenant of police at the close of the reign of Louis XVI. I was desirous that the system of that prefecture should surpass his own, and that had already been carried so far as to perform what would have baffled M. Le Noir's ingenuity, though the duties were more easily carried on in his time than they can be at present. Previous to the year 1790, the privileges of freemen were still in existence. Those privileges naturally divided the population into professions. The corporation of different trades are also in existence and created a separation in the most bustling part of the community. The horse and foot patrol were moreover under the orders of the lieutenant of police, and thus furnished Monsieur Lenoir with immense resources for ascertaining as well as for arresting the progress of any unpleasant occurrences and even preventing them altogether. When I first entered upon my functions, the municipal forces of Paris itself were, on the contrary, under the orders of the military commandant of the capital and the immediate authority of the Minister of War Department. It was not until a year afterwards that I was allowed to raise that legion of horse and foot gendarmes, which is still kept up, and to place it under the direct orders of the prefect of police. At the expiration of a few months, I had so established my system as to be correctly informed of every arrival by the mail and other public conveyances, as well as of every departure from the principal French cities for the metropolis. This was not an indispensable information, but it formed part of the materials relied on for any inquiries it might be found necessary to resort to. This mode of superintendence answered every purpose when it was question of ascertaining the origin and cause of any event, but I had not discovered the key to a knowledge of anything in contemplation which it might be of the utmost importance to prevent. Another idea suggested itself to me, which was to leave to the prefecture of police the duty of watching over Paris, with which I was growing sufficiently well acquainted to understand the reports made to me, and I began to consider the capital under another aspect. Chapter 30. Proceeding to relate the events in the order of their occurrence, I must recall to the reader's recollection that the emperor had directed me to make a report respecting the persons under banishment and the state prisoners. The first decree of banishment was dated in 1805 after the return from the Battle of Austerlitz, and was, I think, applied to 14 individuals. I was anxious to give my personal attention to the materials which were to be the basis of the report. I was desirous of making the emperor on the subject, and it then came to my knowledge that the emperor was ignorant of the smallest details concerning the parties affected by that measure. He knew not what I meant when I spoke to him about them. I felt some curiosity to discover with certainty the grounds upon which he was applied to for an order to banish those 14 individuals. The following is the most correct account I could give of the intrigue of which they were made the victims. I've related that during the year 1805, whilst the emperor was engaged in his campaign at Austerlitz, the banknotes and public funds had experienced a rapid decline, which subjected the Minister of Police to the emperor's displeasure. The minister excused himself by saying that the Faubourg Saint-Germain, which was a ready auxiliary to help him out, was poisoning public opinion by every kind of idle reports. From that quarter had emanated the unfavorable news, the doubts thrown out respecting the success of the army, etc., etc. The emperor grew angry and ordered the matter to be inquired into. The minister of police was then under the necessity of explaining himself and of pointing out the persons whom he considered the most guilty of dealing in those reports, and he was instructed to direct their retiring to their respective estates. A general outcry was raised against this measure, and fearing it would be ascribed to him, as it was quite impossible he could succeed in persuading that the emperor, whilst at the head of his army, attached any importance to idle conversations which he could only have known through the reports from the police. The minister took particular care to acquaint the persons to whom the sentence of banishment applied, and he was a total stranger to what was happening to him, and that the emperor, who had police agents in every direction, had given him a positive order which admitted of no mitigation. Mr. Fouché never failed to name me as the person whom he believed to be commissioned by the emperor for obtaining secret information. He granted them some delay previous to their departure and contrived to send them away satisfied with his explanation, and very far from supposing that he had himself been the cause of the orders sent to him for their banishment. Such is the exact truth. What I have to add will come in support of my assertion. When I presented my report to the emperor, I had some conversation with him on the subject and laid the blame upon Monsieur Fouché for my knowledge of his sources of information, which had already supplied me with a multitude of such revolting details with respect to highly respectable members of society that I should have been ashamed to avail myself of them. To cite a case in point, the minister had persuaded the banished individuals that he had not told the emperor anything to their prejudice. Now for the proof that he sacrificed the emperor's interest to what was personal to himself. Madame Davot, one of the persons condemned to banishment, was a lady as distinguished for her amiable character, as for the constancy of her friendly attachment to an individual who, rather unreservedly, professed certain opinions, which it came within the province of the Minister of Police to notice. When the minister denounced to the emperor the Faubourg Saint-Germain as guilty of distorting the reports coming from the army, he found no difficulty in attaching the blame to that individual whose means of subsisting were derived from Madame Davot's liberality. It would have been much more surprising had he been passed over than if he had figured at the head of the list of proscription. With respect to Madame Davot, it appeared from the materials which I discovered that the accusation directed against her was altogether founded upon an information lodged by a servant, who, if I recollect rightly, had some cause of complaint against his mistress. How then is it to be supposed that the emperor would have attended to similar details conveying to him the information of a mere servant? It requires very little penetration to discover that if he had given way to such weakness, he could have had no time left for attending to his other engagements. If, moreover, he had, without any previous report from the police, given a direct order for banishing those individuals, how could the document relating to Madame Davot have found its way to the police, where it was put into my hands? It is much more probable that it was obtained by the police itself in order to ground upon it the measure of severity of which Madame Davot became the victim. The emperor ordered me to remove every obstacle which obstructed the return of those individuals to their respective homes, with the exception of Madame de Chevreuse, Madame de Stael, Madame de Monsieur de Duras, Monsieur de la Salle, and Madame Recamier. If I have omitted any name, it is because it has escaped my recollection. I shall have no difficulty in explaining how it happened that, after the recall of the exiled individuals, the emperor found it necessary to issue orders for fresh banishments. Previously to explaining the motives for the second measure, it is but justice to state that when the emperor revoked the first, he used the following expressions: "I really do not find in all this a motive for correcting even a child." He asked on this occasion what was intended by the observation so often used. It is the Faubourg Saint-Germain. And who were the persons meant to be pointed out? It was in consequence of this question that I had a long list drawn up, consisting of persons of both sexes, to which I added a note of every particular I had ascertained respecting each, and handed it to him as an account of the flack from which those victims had been selected upon whom he was made to inflict a punishment, when no better proof could be given of zeal for his service. The emperor, on perusing this list, broke out into repeated exclamations of surprise at the existence of so many individuals of the ancient nobility, and expressed a desire that all those who were of age to appear in the world should be presented to him. There was no occasion to repeat this wish a second time, and from that moment I began to consider of the means of prevailing upon all to appear at court. I took advantage of the circumstance of the marriage of the empress to remove the scruples still entertained by a few, and succeeded so well that, with the exception of grandmothers, I forced out into the world all those who were noted down in my catalog as enemies of the government, and who were the subjects of 1,000 other frivolous stories. These families thus got out of the reach of their calumniators, who could no longer make them the subject of false reports, which could have again procured a renewal of their banishment. The old dowagers murmured a little, but generally speaking, young people were delighted with the change, because they were thus invited to partake of amusements which their presence so much contributed to enliven. I personally derived great advantage from this measure, as it secured me from having any alteration or misunderstanding with anyone. My mind, however, retained the impression that there must have been some reason for representing the Faubourg Saint-Germain in such a hideous light, when its feelings could so easily be worked upon with the mere strains of music. The fact is, the Faubourg had been used as an engine for courting popularity. It was made to believe that protection was extended to it against the severity of the emperor, who, in his dislike, only sought an opportunity to strike a blow at it. Its inmates were thus worked upon by being made to dread the emperor, who on his part was encouraged in the opinion that all those ancient families held him in aversion, because he was incessantly told that their whole time was employed in traducing him. I succeeded in a great measure in removing that state of animosity which severed one portion of society from the other. And from that moment, what was called the Savary century went much more along with the court than in opposite direction, as it had hitherto done. I now took upon myself the responsibility of releasing on their parole Messieurs Napoleon, whose period of detention seemed to have no defined limits. I did so upon the representations of persons who pledged themselves that they would never attempt to abuse the indulgence I might show to them. I felt a pleasure in being of service to those two gentlemen, and found my reward in a return of the good opinion of society, which became less averse to me than at the beginning of my administration. The apprehension I had created was gradually diminishing. I had purposely shown an affected anxiety to take upon myself the responsibility of bettering the conditions of Mrs. Napoleon, and I had sent orders to bring them away from Vincennes and make them enter my hotel through the garden gate on the very day when I was aware that Madame Napoleon, who, from what had been reported to her, took me for a monster, intended to call upon me in a state no doubt of the utmost terror in order to obtain a continuation of the leave granted to her to visit them in the dungeon. I received her in my closet, which looked upon the garden, and greatly surprised her by giving up her husband and brother, both of whom she placed in a medical establishment near the corner of the town where she resided, so as to have great facilities of visiting them. The emperor heard of my conduct on this occasion and mentioned it to me in flattering terms. A further proof that he was not naturally disposed to be severe, and that if, owing to some deep-laid scheme, his mind had not been purposely filled by others with evil reports, not one individual should ever have had to complain of any measure of severity emanating from him. It has been industriously circulated that the emperor had a leaning towards the old nobility, and that he would have fancied himself in a republic had he not brought them about his person. This is an unfounded reproach. When the emperor had arrested the disastrous career of the revolution, his intention was to extend his powerful protection to all parties and to remove the spirit of animosity existing between them. It never could have been expected of him that he should recall to France all those whom the calamities of the time had driven from its soil with the view more effectually to destroy them. Such a thought is repugnant to the common feelings of humanity. It behooved him, therefore, to screen them from the attacks of evil designing men. What greater security could they expect from him than that he should bring them about his person? Had he reserved places for them in his administration, a loud clamor would have been raised, whatever talents they might have displayed in the discharge of their duties. What use could he find in courtiers too far advanced in years to shake off those old habits they had contracted from their infancy? It does not appear that he could have acted more judiciously than by leaving them in their natural sphere of action, the precincts of his court, so as to save them from being immured in the castle of Vincennes, to which the exasperation of a party kept in check by the emperor would have infallibly confined them, in order to judge how untenable are the reproaches directed against the emperor for preferring the ancient nobility to the nobles of recent creation. It is necessary to form a correct notion of the latter, as well as of the several classes into which they were subdivided. The emperor's conduct on the occasion was wholly political in its object and tendency. On his earliest ascension to power, he had an opportunity of discovering that the landed property in France was still in the hands of certain ancient families, who, after bringing about the revolution of 1789, and giving their adhesion to it, had nevertheless continued to attend upon and court the various factions that had wrested the supreme authority out of each other's hands from the days of Robespierre himself down to the Directory, who delegated them over to the first consul with the furniture of the Palace of the Luxembourg when they retired from it. Those families could not fail to give in their adhesion to a government more powerful than the one they had just succeeded in overturning, and more disposed to govern in a spirit of moderation. The first consul was accordingly spared the trouble of calling any one of them about his person. They all hastened to join him, and the Duc de Lune, de Praslin, and others soon took their seats in the Senate independently of the many candidates for admission. Besides his families, there were others no less illustrious in former times who had adopted the course of emigrating without encountering the chance of battles. The Archambaults, the Noailles, and others were of that number. They had found the means of returning to France even under the Directory by producing certificates of every description, such as declarations that they had not borne arms against France. It did not become the first consul to be more severe than the government of the Directory. He therefore laid down a regular system in respect to the return of those families by striking them off the list of emigrants and restoring to them whatever part of their property remained unsold, the forests alone excepted. The families that had taken a part in the Civil War had returned to the common social compact ever since the treaty which restored peace to the western departments. Their landed property was accordingly secured to them. Properly speaking, therefore, there only remained the poor provisional nobility, who had emigrated through a sense of honor and of devotedness to the king's cause, had borne arms as common soldiers in the army of the Condé, and when driven to the extremities of distress after the disbanding of that army, had adopted the magnanimous resolution to return to France in spite of all risks and dangers attendant upon such a course, without even taking the precaution of providing themselves with any other passports than such as the Prince of Condé had ordered to be delivered to them upon their discharge. They were not disappointed in their confidence. The first consul not only forbade their being molested, but moreover privately directed that the fact of their having emigrated should not be deemed as a bar to granting the petitions of the greater part who had solicited some inferior places in the several branches of public administration. I must acknowledge it to the credit of all. Not one of them ever failed in abiding by the dictates of honor and the engagements they had contracted towards their benefactor. This numerous and respectable class of men had been almost entirely deprived of their property, because the little they possessed previously to their emigration had been more easily sold from the ready facilities afforded to the purchasers who were desirous of becoming possessed of it. The greater number had therefore returned the perfect sincerity to the useful class of the community. When the first consul assumed the imperial crown, it perceived in consequence the necessity of making the landed proprietors of the country concur in shedding a luster over it. He could not hesitate to surround himself with the families in possession of the property of the land. He had no doubt been the first to remark that none of those who had been raised to high distinction as partakers of his glory were possessed of a patrimonial landed property, and this circumstance induced him at a later period to create that institution of entail, in which his munificence left his predecessors far behind, without even excepting Louis XIV, and yet, in so doing, he did not draw the smallest sum from the public treasury. By a strange abuse of authority, all persons who thus became possessed of property have been deprived since the peace of 1814, and the property so assigned to them, which no one had any right to seize upon, and which even in the case of imperative necessity could not be disposed of without indemnifying the rightful owners. This madness of the party spirit can alone account for such an act of violence, and it may be permitted to hope that those who have acquired such fortunes in defending their country will sooner or later find an administration sufficiently alive to the sense of justice to make a compensation to them for an act of spoliation to which they had not given their consent. And I do not hesitate to appeal to the honor of those emigrants who, having lost their property for taking up arms against France, have attained a pecuniary equivalent for it by a decision of the chambers. The emperor had not therefore shown any preference for ancient families. He acted with justice towards them, and with the exception of a few men of extravagant ideas, to whom he declined paying any attention, and who were generally considered as madmen, he never had occasion to complain of them. He was partial to them, because he relied upon their honorable character. He felt a pleasure in having them about him, because they never appeared in his presence without showing the most respectful deference. Those families had attached themselves to him as their sheet anchor after a storm which had well nigh overwhelmed them in its fury. They had all shown themselves alive to the national glory and to the luster which he shed over every description of service. And I defy the bitterest enemies of those families to point out an individual amongst them who, having been attached to the service or the person of the emperor, has been known to make a traffic of his duty and his honor with the view of raising himself into fresh distinction in the midst of the disasters of 1814. Chapter 31. In the first weeks of my administration, the emperor was desirous of reconsidering the grounds on which state prisoners were detained, a circumstance that placed me under the necessity of examining them in person. And I acknowledge I could not resist a feeling of apprehension on approaching the register of the persons detained, because from the reports that had reached my ears, I expected to find an abyss in which innocent victims were buried alive. How erroneous was such an impression, and how basely calumny has been employed upon this topic, I shall explain with the utmost frankness the condition in which I found this branch in my administration. The name of state prisoner was given to a person who, although detained, could not be judged by the tribunals, because his family had been unanimous in urging his confinement to avoid the disgrace resulting from any judgment given against them. In such a case, the family made a formal demand to the local administration, which inquired into the correctness of the motives alleged by the relatives for the detention of a member of their family who had incurred an ignominious punishment. After thus recognizing and certifying the validity of those motives, the local administration reported the case to the Minister of Police, who asked the emperor's consent for confining the prisoner, and in order to spare the family from any humiliation, he was transferred to a house of detention at a considerable distance from them. This system had, in some respects, replaced the lettre de cachet of the old regime, and as we had no longer any colonies to which all worthless subjects might be removed, as was the case in former times, it was necessary to adopt some means for relieving society from their presence upon the special demand and for the interest of private families. Besides this class of prisoners, there was another, consisting of men who, having been brought before the tribunal for serious charges in which they had been implicated, had escaped some incidental circumstance which placed them beyond the reach of the law, though they still bore the stigma of being accomplices of certain bands of chauffeurs or plunderers of the public chests and public conveyances, and who, in the hope of concealing their disorderly conduct by throwing the color of party over it, assumed the names of royalists, or were the acknowledged ringleaders of all the bad characters of a district. These men were generally detained after judgment, either at the suit of the Solicitor General to the tribunal or the application of the local administrations, grounded upon the necessity of maintaining order and public tranquility, but those detentions were never made upon arbitrary grounds. Third class consisted of persons detained for political crimes. It was supposed by everyone to be a very numerous class, whereas the reverse was the case. It did not exceed 40 persons upon the whole population of France, Belgium, Piedmont, Tuscany, and the Roman states, a proportion short of 1 in every million. This number, it must be observed, includes individuals arrested in consequence of the Civil War, and who had again become the ringleaders of such perilous enterprise. The greater number were liable to be sent before special tribunals, where surely not one could have escaped condemnation. The emperor himself opposed this course, because, said he, time allayed all ferment, and would bring those persons back to their senses. As they had done so, many other times in France. It also included those who had been condemned to death but whose sentence had been commuted to imprisonment for an indefinite period. Lastly, it included certain priests who had been arrested for attempting, under the cloak of the ministry, to sow disunion in families. I have known some of those wretches, for example, who had availed themselves of the confessional to acquire an ascendancy over the minds of weak young women and prevail upon them to break the conjugal bond which united them to their husbands, because the latter had served the state or had purchased national domains. Others had refused to Christian children born in marriages contracted during the Revolution. Others again were detained for using the pretext of pious exercises to draw to their houses young girls whom they had subjected to the most shameful state of degradation. It was not a feeling of consideration for those hypocrites which had prevented their being sent before the tribunals, but a sense of shame that would have been reflected back upon the family of the children whose innocence they had despoiled, a regard for the clergy at large, and a respect for public decency. Those different classes of prisoners composed a total of 600 persons and upward, including foreigners, by whom I mean those who were such at the time when a country was annexed to France, as well as certain Spaniards who, after swearing fidelity to King Joseph, had betrayed him to go over to the insurgents, amongst whom they had afterwards been found. The emperor had not been a 12-month on the throne when he wrote to acquaint the minister of police that he had issued a decree appointing 2 counselors of state to visit all the state prisoners, and to desire that he would communicate to them every document in virtue of which each person had been arrested and put into confinement. It thus became the minister's duty to hand over to these 2 counselors the bundle of documents relating to each prisoner, and when they had been provided with these papers, they made the round of all the prisons of France where such prisoners were kept in confinement. They carried with them an order from the minister of police for the throwing open of the prison gates as often as they thought proper to visit the prisons. Their instructions directed that they should see each individual prisoner, and in order to avoid the possibility of anyone being kept concealed from their view, they began by satisfying themselves that the statement handed to them by the Minister of Police on their departure from Paris was conformable to the register of the records of the prison, in which are entered the expenses of the prisoners, so that if it had been attempted to immure a single person over and above the number without registering his name in the record book, the consequence would be that the charge of supporting such prisoner would have fallen upon the keeper of the prisoner castle, a supposition altogether improbable. There was therefore the most positive check upon the introduction of a greater number of prisoners than those submitted to inspection. They were afterwards successfully questioned by the counselors of state, who had to pronounce upon the validity of the grounds of their detention. Their families were written to, the authorities of the place examined, and they thus exercised a rigorous scrutiny over the acts of the minister of police. This visit lasted several months, and the emperor generally selected the month of November for hearing the reports of the councillors of state, who mostly returned towards the end of the preceding month. This report was made at a privy council, consisting of the arch-chancellor, the arch-treasurer, the prince of Benevento, the grand judge, the ministers of war, the interior, and of the police, the president of the tribunal of cassation, those of the sections of the interior and of the legislation of the council of state, several senators, the 4 state councilors attached to the ministry of police, and lastly, the Secretary of State. The 2 counselors of state read their reports in the presence of this council and gave their opinion on the case of each of the prisoners they had visited. When they had spoken on the case of one individual, the minister of police was required to state the grounds of his detention. The emperor then took the opinion of every member of the council in regard to each prisoner, whether he should continue under confinement or be set at liberty. The whole business could not be gone through in one sitting, but they were continued until the case of every prisoner had been disposed of. The minister, Secretary of State, then drew up a statement of the prisoners set at liberty and of those retained in confinement. He addressed to the Minister of Police a minute of the proceedings of the several sittings with the results of what had been decided, whereupon the Minister of Police delivered to the keepers of the different dungeons where the prisoners were confined an order for setting them at liberty. If any attempt had been made to avoid the giving effect to such orders, it would necessarily have been defeated, because the Minister's Secretary of State transmitted to the Grand Judge a duplicate of the minute sent to him to the Minister of Police, and the Grand Judge directed the Crown solicitors to see to the execution of the clauses contained in the Emperor's decree, and to report their having done so. Such was the spirit of equity which provided over the decisions affecting the freedom of citizens. I have never had a knowledge of any secret detentions, nor of any kind of ill treatment sanctioned by the Emperor's order, and I have received a score of instructions from him in which he enjoined me to be particularly on my guard, never to transgress the limits of the Constitution without first submitting the grounds which might require my departure from them. I even received a letter from the Emperor on one occasion, wherein he told me that there were 2 arbitrary powers in France, over and above what there ought to be. His power and mine. I recollect that at one of those privy councils, the Emperor perceived that in the report of a visit to the prisons which had been presented to him by 2 councillors of state, Messieurs Dubois and Corvetto, whom he frequently entrusted with those commissions, they pronounced no opinion on the notes I had delivered to them before their departure respecting a prison situated amongst the Alps. The Emperor guessed they had not examined it. He put the question to them, when, fearing to disguise the truth, they merely stated in their own justification their having learned his return to Paris sooner than they had expected, and their unwillingness to protract or extend their visits, that he might not have to wait for their reports. The Emperor expressed himself in terms of strong displeasure at their neglect, and directed them to take their departure the next morning and proceed on a visit to the prison in question.